Hello and welcome to the first interview podcast with an external speaker at the Institute of Molecular Cell and Systems Biology at the University of Glasgow. Today, myself, Emily Armstrong, at Emily X Armstrong, and Maria Papanazio, M_Papanazio, join Dr. Mary Williams, who is Fellow of Plant Cell and Teaching Tools in Plant Science. Mary was invited to give a seminar surrounding social media for scientists as part of our Women in Science lecture series. Our conversation covers science outreach and social media, diversity and power struggles within scientific research, and how Mary manages to balance her work alongside her family. You can find out more on her Twitter, at Plant Teaching, and see what our institute's been up to at U of G IMCSB. Okay. Hi Mary, so tell us a little about your career and yourself. What steps did you take to get to where you are today?
Well, I started out as a undergraduate, and then I got a PhD and did a postdoc, and then I took a position at a teaching-focused institution, and I was there for 15 years or so, and I did some volunteer work for the American Society of Plant Biologists. I was the chair of the education committee, and we did a lot of work to try and get both university level and high school and primary level teachers as well prepared as they could for teaching about plants. And then I came on sabbatical to Glasgow and got married while I was here. And so we had to decide if we would stay in Glasgow, which my husband really wanted to do. And I said, I've got a full professorship in California. Why would I want? But I actually really like Glasgow, so that was kind of a motivation to stay. But I said, well, if I can find work that it's interesting to me, I'll stay. And then the ASPB just then had been considering hiring somebody to develop educational materials full time. So they offered me the position, and they said, yeah, we don't care where you live. So it worked out perfectly. It was just one of those right place, right time, right job things that got very lucky.
Brilliant. So what first drew you to working with plants and in plant science?
Well, as a child, I was very interested in nature, but like many kids, I was interested in animals, and I liked marine biology a lot, and so I kind of did a roundabout way of getting into plants, where I was interested in environmental science, and then biochemistry, and then transcription, and it just so happened when I was starting my PhD that tools became available to look at gene expression in plants using transgenic plants and reporter genes. And so I kind of saw plants as a good model for understanding multicellular transcriptional switches. And at the time, I could have worked with Drosophila, but I really just not a bug person. So, tobacco plants, which is what we were using at the time, they're not very nice either. They're sticky and gross and pretty horrible, as you know. So, I didn't really appreciate plants for plants until I did my postdoc. And then I did it with a real sort of botany-focused person who just appreciated everything about plants. And I felt like my eyes were open to how interesting plants are. And then when I became a professor, many plant science departments have quite a few plant scientists, so you might teach your area of specialty, whereas I was the only plant scientist in our biology department. So suddenly I realized I had to teach photosynthesis, right? Transport, all this. So a lot of it was just sort of having to teach the material made me learn about it. And I remember the first time I went to a plant, ASPB used to be the American Society of Plant Physiologists. The first time I went to one of those meetings, and I went to the talks I wanted to see, but I also went to the talks where I didn't really know what they were going to be talking about. I remember sitting there in one of these photosynthesis sessions, just being completely blown away and kind of realizing I just didn't know very much. So it's a huge field, really. There's not a lot of people working in it, but it's so broad. So you go to these talks where they're talking about alternative oxidases. I remember sitting there, what the hell is an alternative? I've never heard of this before. So, so I just think the more I learn about plants, the more interesting they are. And for me, the big interesting question has been always, for a long time, the developmental responsiveness of plants and the fact that they they make roots when they need more water or more nitrogen or something, and if they're shaded, they grow taller. And I just think that understanding the whole control system of how those decisions are made and how does a plant optimize its growth is a really exciting question to me.
Brilliant. So you're features editor in Plant Cell, and what does this involve?
Well, as I said, I was hired originally to develop the set of online teaching articles, and it was kind of a vague idea when they hired me. So I had to do a bit of trial and error and try and figure out what they would look like. And so for quite a few years, that's all I did. I just wrote these articles. But then more recently, in the past 3 years or so, I've become more and more involved in a sort of broader set of communications about plant science. So I still do the teaching tools, but I do most of the social networking for the ASPB, and so I write a lot of blog posts, and I tweet a lot, and I occasionally make infographics. So it's a pretty broad and diverse set of things I do, most of which I guess wouldn't have been possible when I was a PhD student, right? I mean, that was still the days when you went to the library and photocopied articles.
Yeah.
So this whole digital revolution, most of what I do now really depends upon the current technology and evolves with the technology.
So following on from that, so when did you first get involved in social media? What sort of clicked when you realised sort of how important social media would be for scientists and researchers?
Well, my two pals who are involved in professional societies, Sarah Blackford, who we were talking about from the Society for Experimental Biology, and Ruth Bastow, who's at the time she was involved in the Garnet, the Arabidopsis Research Network, and now she's involved in the Global Plant Council. She's executive director. The two of them kind of ganged up on me and told me to do more of it, and I trust them both, so I did. But it was really apparent immediately that this was a powerful medium. The other thing is that when this idea of teaching tools was developed, the idea that we might need a marketing budget didn't occur to anybody. So there was no money set aside to put in an ad in Trends in Plant Science or something about this new thing. So I ended up doing all the marketing of the new project myself, using the free tools of social media, where the only thing it costs is your time, right? Which is if you're willing to work 80 hours a week, time is cheap, right? But yeah, and I mean, now I find that I feel like I know people very well, and it's sort of surprising to me sometimes to realize that I've never met them, but we've been talking to each other on Twitter for 4 years or something, and so. And of course, I'll be talking about that today. So for those who haven't quite figured out how important this is in their career, hoping to encourage them to.
Especially the old school people.
Yeah.
That's the most difficult.
I don't think the old school people are going to come, so that's the problem.
We'll
Yeah.
try to.
Yeah, we try.
We'll see.
Pizza, beer,
So what are your preferred social media platforms to work with, do you think? What do you think is more effective to disseminate information?
Well, I think Twitter is very good, and I probably spend most of my time on Twitter. I did a little research a couple of years ago to ask who was accessing the teaching tools using these different platforms. And the surprising thing was that we have a very different population that uses Facebook and Twitter, at least in terms of my projects. So, for example, Twitter, the 4 biggest countries that follow teaching tools on Twitter are USA, UK, Canada, and Australia, all English-speaking countries. Whereas the 4 biggest countries that follow teaching tools on Facebook are India, Pakistan, and I can't remember what else, something else. But the English language is very much emphasized on Twitter because you used to be more word-based than it is. Whereas in India, Facebook is huge in India, and pretty much people use it seamlessly for personal and professional roles. So they don't quite use it. A lot of people use Facebook only personally in the UK and the US, and they don't really see it as a type of business thing. And one of the things I've been working on this year, which has been a slow process, is going with WeChat, which is the sort of Twitter for China. But I don't speak Chinese, so it's difficult. But I've been working with someone, and she doesn't always get things quite right. So the one she posted today had the title of one paper attached to the abstract of a different paper, because she's not a scientist. So it's much more difficult to do WeChat, but we realize that there's a huge potential.
Absolutely.
And we already have a few dozen followers, even though we've just started it.
That's the China market.
Yeah.
The numbers are totally different.
Absolutely. So, what are your cardinal rules for a scientist on social media?
Well, I have personal rules, and I can only, I suppose, make suggestions. But I mean, I don't. I think a lot of people are frightened off from social media when they see people being abusive, and it's not just like the crazies, but some academics can be abusive. For example, let's say you naively use an archaic term for someone based on their ethnic group or something. An innocent mistake can get you the same level of vitriol as a blatant racist term. And that really frightens a lot of people off because they feel like they're exposing themselves to public humiliation. So I don't advocate that. I think if someone screws up and you give them the benefit of the doubt and maybe privately say we don't use that term anymore. but the public shaming, I think, is a major hurdle for a lot of people to getting the benefit from it. So I don't really see the need to that. I mean, I think it's more about stroking their own ego. I'm better than you because I can publicly shame you, and I don't see the point of that. No, I used to always say that it was better to avoid politics, but I've become a little bit more like a lot of scientists, and now I think, I don't want to engage in political fights, but I also, if I see pseudoscience or falsehoods being portrayed as truth, I might be more likely to respond to that, because I think if the only people who are using social media are the far right, then we're not maybe doing, and if we're just over here talking about photosynthesis and they're all, burning crosses, then maybe we're not doing enough to kind of show that there's some resistance to that. So I haven't figured out the balance, and I don't do very much at all. But I've kind of backed off on that rule. I think if you want to get politically involved, still be respectful, still don't public shame people, but don't necessarily ignore what's going on either.
So, moving away from the social media side of things, the seminar you'll be giving today is part of our Women in Science series. What advice do you have for women beginning their career as research scientists, and do you think it's harder for women to establish themselves in this environment?
Yeah, I actually will talk about that a bit in the seminar. And yes, there's this whole notion of outsider status, and it's a historical basis, whereas white men have traditionally held all the power, and whether you're a woman or an ethnic minority or disabled or whatever, you're automatically an outsider. So anybody, woman or otherwise, who has that status has a harder road to travel to get to be a senior scientist or a professor or whatever. And I think, I'm encouraged because, for example, the Royal Society has really kind of taken the lead, and that's where it has to come from. Having women complain that the playing field isn't level has always been seen by some men as, whiny women. So you need people in authority like the Royal Society or the BBSRC to take charge of addressing historical imbalances. So I'm happy to see that is happening, and I'm happy to see that it's happening in, I think, a really positive and effective way. Again, as I'll say something in my talk, emphasizing the fact that diversity isn't really just about quotas and filling numbers. It's really about kind of changing the culture, and that's what has to happen for everyone to have a seat at the table, and not assigning seats. So I think the United States is quite well. barring barring the far right and the half of the United States who are sane, people in academia tend to be quite progressive, and I think you have a more progressive attitude with the progressives in the United States, and I think Britain, at least when I came here in 2008, seemed like almost a generation behind in understanding issues of diversity compared to the U.S. So I think in the U.S., a lot of the hard battles have been done, and I'm seeing it's happening much faster here. And again, we as scientists, we want to be judged on our merit, not our background or our accent or any of these superficial things. So do I have any advice? I think mentors really is advice, and I think anyone who feels like they don't have everything going perfectly smoothly for them should take charge of finding mentors. And there's a great diagram, which I didn't bring with me, but I can send you, which is the Women's Geological Union has made a sort of mentor tree, and it's all the different kinds of mentors everybody needs, not just women, but there's mentors to help you with writing, mentors to help you with career progression, mentors to help you with work-life balance. And so you can actually imagine not just a single mentor, but it's a whole network of informal mentors, and that's something that people can kind of actively think about, and identify people who they can learn from or have an informal chat with. I mean, most people will be happy to get treated to lunch, right? So if I take you out to lunch, will you tell me about how to write my first grant proposal or something? So I think that this idea of being a little bit of control over your mentoring is the best advice I have.
Brilliant. So moving away from the more academic side of things, we want to get to know a bit more about you. So we're wondering, what interests or hobbies do you have outside of your work? If any.
Well, I mean, we have 3 kids, and so they, of course, are a huge amount of work. But we also have a dog. So my hobby lately is playing with a dog, and that's what I look forward to every weekend, is going somewhere. I mean, living in Scotland, it's great because 15 minutes at the most, and you're out in beautiful countryside. And our dog loves to swim, so we go someplace like Loch Lomond or even the Clyde estuary where he can swim, and it's a great day out. And my husband just took a picture of me where I was watching the dog swim, and it's so funny because I've got this big smile on my face, and I'm not smiling at the camera, I'm smiling at the dog. But it's amazing how good I feel when I've come back from playing with a dog, and it's such a simple thing, but
So in the same vein, sort of tell us a little bit about your family life and how you manage to balance home and work so successfully.
Yeah, that's hard. I think for women who have children, men too, but the job always is heaviest on the women's shoulders. The most important thing is good childcare. And if you have access to good, reliable childcare, that can mean that you can actually go through your day not thinking about your kids and just focus on work. And most people can get a good day's work done in 8 hours. And then you go home and you deal with all the family issues. And, if you're lucky and you have enough energy, a few nights a week you work later after the family time is behind you. But it does mean that you have to be able to focus. And if you're constantly getting phone calls about, issues, then you can't really get into the focus. So having, I think, that kind of really good childcare is critical. And for some people it might be, the kid's grandmother, and for other people they just pay a lot. It's always a problem that childcare is expensive, especially for the youngest kids. You have to pay practically your whole salary to have a kid in daycare. But in the long run, it gets cheaper. My kids, so I actually was a single mom for 7 years before I remarried in Scotland, and that was really tough. But I did have very good childcare. But my kids, knew that I had work to do. And it never was much of an issue with them because once I was with them, this is a funny story, but when my oldest son was about 2 or 3, we were playing that go fish game where you do you have an 8 sort of thing, and I was thinking about work, and so he said something like, "Do you have a 5?" And I said, "No, go fish." And then I said, do you have a 5? And obviously, you know, I hadn't really been listening to him, right? He threw his cards down and he said, Mom, if you're not going to pay attention to me when you're supposed to be playing with me, then don't even bother. And he stormed out of the room. And that was such an awakening to me because it really did make me realize that when I'm at work, I don't want to think about my kids. And when I'm with my kids, I don't want to think about work because it's not fair to them. I mean, it's really... You know, who wants a parent who ignores them, or they're always second priority. So I do think that setting aside the weekends and the dinner times to be with the kids and focus on the kids has helped them a lot. And you know, I think they're really proud to have a mom who's a successful scientist and all this. And yeah.
Okay, so this is a bit off key. What was the last book that you read that wasn't for work?
Oh, I should say something really intellectual.
No,
Anything.
Well, I read, I like the Scottish noir, you know, the tartan noir it's called. So there's a whole series of books with these private eyes or detectives that take place in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And I read a series that took place in the little peninsula that hangs down. I can't remember what peninsula that's called. And then I've been reading some that took place in the Shetland Islands and Aberdeen, and I can't remember the names of any of the books, but that's what I do for fun, sort of get my mind off things. I have to really basically read before I go to sleep, otherwise I can't sleep, so I just read all of them. And then I bought the one that was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, but I haven't read it yet. I've been carrying it around for about 3 weeks now, but I haven't cracked it open.
So our last question is, you would have travelled a lot throughout your career, and what was your favourite place to visit and why?
Well, probably Japan. And I can't wait to go back, but I don't have any plans to go back. But one of the really nice things was I went with my son, who was, I think, 14 at the time, and he was kind of Pokemon crazy when he was a boy, and he just grew up wanting to go to Japan. And he loves Japanese food. He's taken Japanese language classes. And Japan's a gorgeous, wonderful place, and it's safe, you know, and it's really nice. It's important for me to feel safe when we travel. So we spent a week at the Arabidopsis meeting in Yokohama, and then we took the train up into the mountains to the shrines at Nikko, and he planned the whole trip. I remember we walked into Tokyo Central Station to change trains, and I was just, and he's like, no, over here, you know, led me. So it was so fun to see him kind of living this fantasy of being in Japan, and then going off into the mountains with all these shrines. And there's just so many wonderful and fascinating things. Like there was this whole row of stone, I guess, Buddhas, but they look more like babies, and they were all wearing like little red cloth hats. You know, I mean, it was some sort of festival or thing or something. It was just out of the blue. But so yeah, probably
Brilliant.
Japan.
Amazing.
Although I do like lots of different places too, but Japan really stands out.
Okay. Do you have any questions you want to ask, or I think
No.
that's it? It's
I
brilliant.
wait.
And that's it for our first podcast with Dr. Mary Williams. Check back for more interviews and videos in the next few weeks.